According to Reuters, the total debt across governments, corporations, and households worldwide has exceeded $320 trillion. That's around 3 times the world's total economy. That's equivalent to everyone in the world owing $30,000. Governments are borrowing like there's no tomorrow. Corporations are leveraging billions. And everyday people, well, they're stuck in credit card debt, student loans, and rising mortgage payments. But is looking at just the total debt misleading? Is it just a necessary part of modern economics? The debt to GDP ratio compares a country's total debt to its economic output. The debt to GDP ratio is equal to the gross domestic product, that is the GDP by the total government debt multiplied by 100. If the country's ratio is greater than 100%, it means that the country owes more than it produces. In 2024, the United States federal debt stood at approximately 124%, Japan's at 260%, Sri Lanka's over 100%, and India at 83%. But to see if this is actually concerning, we need to understand what these countries are doing with the debt. But is all debt bad, or is this just the price of progress? Robert Kiyosaki explains this by emphasizing on good debt and bad debt. It is good debt when you're borrowing to build assets, and it's bad when used for liabilities. Let's understand this with a simple example. Let's say Alex takes a $200,000 loan to buy a rental property. His mortgage payments are $1,200 a month, but he rents it out for $2,000 a month. After expenses, he still makes a profit of $500 every month. The property appreciates over time, and he's using other people's money, in this case, the bank's, to build wealth. That is good debt. On the other hand, imagine Sarah buys a $50,000 car with a loan. Her monthly payments are $800, plus insurance, maintenance, and gas. Unlike the rental property, the car loses value over time, and she's stuck paying interest. By the time she pays off the loan, she's shelled out way more than $50,000, and the car is worth half of what she paid. That's a financial trap. After the Korean War that took place from 1950 to 1953, South Korea was in economic ruin. The country's GDP per capita was less than $100, making it one of the poorest nations in the world. But here's the brilliant thing they did. The South Korean government took direct control over financial institutions. So unlike countries that let private banks lend freely, only companies in priority sectors such as steel, shipbuilding, semiconductors, automobiles, and electronics received government-backed loans. South Korea strategically borrowed billions of dollars to develop these key industries and created some major players like POSCO, Hyundai, Samsung, and LG. The government forced companies to focus on exports instead of just serving the domestic market. This brought in foreign currency like US dollars, yen, etc., which helped repay external debts. But not every country has been this strategic with borrowing. Between 2005 and 2019, Sri Lanka took on billions in loans. A large chunk of this debt went into massive infrastructure projects that were supposed to boost the economy. But here's the problem. Many of these projects didn't generate enough revenue. In 2019, the government slashed taxes to boost growth. Sounds great, right? But in reality, it drained government revenue and scared away foreign investors. Soon, the country was borrowing even more just to stay afloat. Meanwhile, Sri Lanka was relying heavily on tourism. In fact, tourism made up 12% of the country's economy. Then COVID-19 hit, wiping out a major source of income. But instead of finding new ways to generate revenue, the government made things worse. With no other options, Sri Lanka's central bank started printing money. But printing money doesn't create value. It just makes everything more expensive. Inflation soared to over 50%. Food prices skyrocketed, fuel shortages hit the country, and protests erupted everywhere. Sri Lanka was heavily dependent on imports for machinery, fuel, steel, fabrics, and gold, due to its structurally weak economy and lack of domestic production capacity. Without a strong industrial base and self-sufficient economy, countries remain vulnerable. Well, no major country is completely self-sufficient because some level of trade is necessary for growth. Instead, the goal is to be strategically self-sufficient, producing critical goods locally while trading for non-essential items. When we talk about global debt, we often think about governments and big corporations borrowing billions of dollars. But here's the twist. Individual debt plays a crucial role in global debt accumulation. Every loan, every credit card swipe, every mortgage adds up to a much larger financial system of borrowing and lending. Individuals take on debt for home loans, student loans, credit card debts, personal loans. These are what economists call household debt. But how does this link to global debt? When people take out loans, they spend more, hence driving up the demand. This helps businesses grow, contributes to overall GDP. Sounds great, right? Not exactly. Let's understand this better. If the economy is bad, people fail to repay loans, banks lose their money and reduce lending. This would result in a stock market panic, and investors withdraw funds. Then the government steps in to bail out these banks. As the government takes on loans, public debt increases even more as they have to adjust interest rates. Again, the economy slows down, purchasing power reduces, and things become expensive. And guess what? The economy is stuck in a vicious cycle. In the 1990s, Argentina borrowed heavily from the IMF and issued bonds to global investors. To control inflation, the Argentine peso was pegged to the US dollar. However, the economy stagnated, exports fell, and debt levels soared to $132 billion. The government froze bank accounts to prevent withdrawals. People lost access to their savings, leading to mass protests. Argentina defaulted on $95 billion, the largest sovereign default in history at the time. Debt default can happen to businesses when they can't generate enough revenues, and even governments if they fail to repay. But a default doesn't mean a country, company, or individual is doomed forever. The borrower has three main options. They can either negotiate with lenders to extend repayment deadlines or reduce interest rates, or have governments step in or print more money to inflate away debt. Now comes the big question. Are we heading toward a global debt crisis? As of 2024, the U.S. is the world's biggest debtor, with over $34 trillion in national debt. Next in the list is Japan, whose debt to GDP is 251%, followed by China, United Kingdom, and France. In 2023, the U.S. spent $6.1 trillion, but only collected $4.4 trillion in revenue, leading to a $1.7 trillion deficit, which had to be borrowed. During the 2008 financial crisis, the U.S. borrowed trillions to rescue banks and companies. In 2020, during the COVID-19 pandemic, the U.S. borrowed $5 trillion for stimulus checks and business bailouts. But why can the U.S. borrow like crazy? The U.S. dollar is the world's reserve currency, meaning most countries use it for trade and savings. This creates huge demand for U.S. government bonds, making it easy for the U.S. to borrow at low interest rates. Investors believe these governments will always be able to repay their debt, so they lend money at low interest rates. The U.S. has the largest and most productive economy that is approximately $27 trillion GDP in 2023. So does that mean the U.S. debt is not a concern? Not exactly. If major economies like the U.S., Japan, or the EU struggle to repay their debts, the ripple effects would hit developing countries the hardest. Here's why. If the U.S. faces a debt crisis, investors will panic and pull money out of risky markets like the emerging economies. This means higher interest rates and less access to foreign investment for developing nations. The dollar would lose value, leading to currency crises in developing nations that rely on dollars for trade and debt payments. Countries like Argentina, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, and Nigeria that have high dollar-denominated debt would struggle to repay, leading to defaults. The U.S. is also the biggest buyer of goods from developing nations. If the U.S. faces a debt crisis, Americans will spend less, meaning fewer exports for countries like China, India, Mexico, Vietnam, and Bangladesh. This could trigger mass layoffs, factory closures, and an economic slowdown in export-dependent economies. When a country's debt gets out of control, two major things happen. Firstly, inflation skyrockets. Governments print more money to cover debt, making currency lose value. This leads to rising prices and economic instability. Then, as debt grows, the cost of borrowing rises. Countries end up paying more on interest than on essential services. Take Argentina as an example. With over $400 billion in debt and inflation soaring past 200%, prices double every few months. This means people's savings lose value overnight, making basic goods unaffordable. The real danger isn't just having debt, it's what happens when a country can't pay it back. This is when we enter debt crisis territory. A debt crisis doesn't just affect one country, it can trigger global recessions, market crashes, and financial instability. Now, here's a question for you. Do you think your country is using debt wisely? Are we investing in the future, or just borrowing at the cost of tomorrow? Let us know in the comments.